and welcome to the Amplifying Scientific Innovation video podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Sophia Onoye, founder and CEO of the Sophia Consulting Firm, a life science marketing and communications consultancy that was established in New York City with the goal of amplifying scientific innovation. The goal of this podcast is to showcase scientific innovation stemming from global life science companies through conversations with senior leaders who share their unique leadership journey, corporate vision, and industry outlook. My guest today is Ms. Sandra "Sandy" Amaro, Diversity and Clinical Trials Operations Director at Pfizer, one of the world's premier biopharmaceutical companies. Sandy holds an MBA from the University of Rhode Island and a Bachelor of Science in Business Management from Albert Magnus College. I was connected to Sandy through the Pfizer Corporate Affairs team as a result of my relationship with Angela Wang, a member of Pfizer's executive team and group president of the Pfizer Biopharmaceuticals Group. I am truly excited to speak with Sandy today about clinical trial diversity, which is a major theme for season 3 of the video podcast. Moreover, I started out my career as a Pfizer scientist down in Groton, Connecticut, at the same R&D facilities that Sandy has worked in for almost 2 decades. Welcome to the show, Sandy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
It's my absolute pleasure. And I typically start the show the same way, which is asking people, what is their definition of scientific innovation? So Sandy, today is your turn. Tell me, what is it?
So when I think of scientific innovation, I think you can go down a big rabbit hole, right? What is it? And I think it's probably different to everyone, but I think when I think about innovation from a science perspective, it's really a way for us to introduce novel ways to do our work more efficiently and effectively. So how do we introduce new insights and really listen to the voice of patients, caregivers, advocacy partners, and how do we take those insights so that we can be more innovative in our approach when it comes to science and how we conduct our clinical trials at Pfizer?
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more about the power and the importance of listening. Patient advocacy plays such an important role. And how are you going to create therapies for patients without actually listening to those patients, understanding their pain points, their challenges, not just from a sort of physiological perspective, but psychosocially as well. So thank you for that very comprehensive definition. So my next question to you is, what would you consider to be your most impactful professional or scientific accomplishment prior to your current role at Pfizer?
So this question's interesting because I feel like I've grown up at Pfizer, right? So I've been at Pfizer for 16 years, like you stated in the start. And I feel like I've just grown up here. So it's hard for me to think about a time when I haven't been associated with Pfizer. So when I think about this question, I just feel that I'm most proud of all of the years that I've worked at Pfizer. Like for me, that's been most impactful for my career, because this is where I really have grown up. And I think for me, most impactful has been, I've been at Pfizer for 16 years, but the last 3 years, I've been focused on clinical trial diversity, equity, inclusion in our clinical trials. And I feel like the last 3 years have probably been the most impactful for me personally and professionally, knowing that I am playing a part in decreasing healthcare disparities, bringing clinical trial opportunities to underserved communities so that we can advance and close the gap, because there's such a huge disparity gap. And so I feel like the last 3 years have been the most impactful.
Yeah, and I honestly cannot wait to get into that, because that's going to form a critical component of our discussion today. I guess to reframe the question then, what is it that led you to apply to work at Pfizer in the first place? Like, what ignited your interest in the pharmaceutical industry, really?
Yeah, so I grew up in Groton, in Connecticut, and live in Groton, Connecticut. And Pfizer is such a well-known entity in this community. And I just wanted to be a part of that. I wanted to be a part of an organization and a company that was really driving medicine to the people that needed it. And I just wanted to be a part of it. And I didn't know what that looked like when I first had the drive to apply to be a part of Pfizer as an organization. I didn't really know what it looked like. And my roles really evolved over the course of the last 16 years. But I think what drove me to Pfizer was just the fact that I grew up in Connecticut, and Pfizer's just like a well-known entity. And if you don't know someone that works at Pfizer, you know, you probably live under a rock here in Connecticut.
I know.
Yeah.
And having lived in Groton myself, I can honestly tell you that when I lived in Groton, if you say you work at Pfizer, it was just like 40% of the population seemed to work at Pfizer. And there was this sort of sense of community that even if you were not a scientist, knowing that you could find a role at the organization where you could still apply yourself and to add value, I felt that was really incredible. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, I've said this already, I feel like I've grown up in this company, and I met my husband here, right?
Oh!
This is where I met my husband, and we have 2 children. So I feel like I owe so much to this company, both professionally and personally, right?
That's wonderful, and I'm really pleased to hear that. I think there's such a strong intersection and interconnectivity between your personal and professional life, and when you can find ways to grow and in both aspects while working in an organization, I can understand why you have this remarkable passion for working at Pfizer, and I can relate it in many ways. So my next question for you is, what is your leadership mantra? And if you think about that leadership mantra, how has it helped to create opportunities for team and organizational advancement, especially for minorities and women?
Yeah, so when I think of my leadership mantra, I really, as a leader, really feel like leaders should lead by example, right? And so I feel like it's always been important for me as a leader to inspire a team or an organization to come along on the journey, right? And I feel like leaders need to dig in and sometimes roll up their sleeves with their people, right? You need to get people on board, because a lot of times what we're trying to tackle is not easy.
Right.
There's not an easy answer to the things that we're trying to tackle, and you need a team that will come along with you because they're inspired by your messaging and the fact that you are not afraid to dig into the work and do it alongside with them, right? And I feel like I've been so fortunate at Pfizer to have such strong leaders and mentors during all of these years at Pfizer. And my very first manager at Pfizer, I happened to be with her for many years, which is unusual at such a large company. Usually managers move and shift, but I was with her for many years, and she is still to this day someone that I go to for advice, and I look to her as a mentor. And she just was a true example of a people manager. She was here for her people. She grew her people in a way to give them opportunities. And for me, coming into this company younger, having a woman really drive change and really take you, like she took me under her wing to give me opportunities and to help grow me as a professional. And the one thing that I will always remember, the one piece of advice that she gave me, and now I kind of give this to the people that I'm working with, is, especially for women, right? Is whenever you are presented with an opportunity to do something, whether it's scary and it's really large and you don't think you can do it, she told me, you say yes.
Yes.
You say yes to that opportunity, because many times as women, we tend to second guess ourselves. We question our ability, and we think that we can't do it. But she told me, you say yes and you figure it out. You say yes to the opportunity, and then you dig in and you make it happen. And I think that's such a powerful message for women in corporate America, in industry, and for our young women that are coming up, right?
Right.
And so I share this now with people that are on my team, just to, sometimes you're presented with opportunities and you think you can't do it. But guess what? We all can. And that's why we're in the positions we're in. And sometimes we just need that little push to say, you got this, you can do this. And so I've just been really blessed with the people that I've been connected with here at Pfizer. And I'll always go back to this one manager, because she was so crucial in shaping a large part of my career.
Wow. I mean, that's a powerful story, and I can relate in so many ways. But what I love the most about what you've shared so far is the emphasis on the can-do attitude. I cannot say enough about that. And I think, to your point, I think sometimes women second guess ourselves, and there are data out there that show that I think roughly 60% of women, we feel like we have to meet 100% of a job requirement before we apply for it, versus saying like, okay, I think I have, just about enough, but I'm going to work hard and I can get through it. So thank you for sharing that very practical knowledge. That's very helpful. So my next question for you is the one that is a central theme for today's conversation. What inspired your interest in clinical trial diversity?
So 3 years ago, there was an internal job posting for the role that I'm in today, which is the clinical trial diversity operations lead. And I think there's two parts to this question. I think professionally, when I looked at this job posting, I just thought it would be such a great opportunity for me to continue to grow in my career, for me to help impact patient and participant lives, like to be closer to the patient. And knowing that there was such a huge gap in healthcare disparities, I could play a role in advancing this work. And so for me professionally, I felt like this is an area that I could jump into, and I could continue to learn, and hopefully impact, make an impact for our patients and our participants, specifically within those communities of color that have been historically underserved.
Yeah.
So I felt, for professional reasons, I felt like it was a really great move for me. But then personally, I've married into a very large and loving Dominican family, and I'm raising Dominican children. And so knowing that people that look like my family are typically underrepresented in healthcare systems, clinical trials, and are quite often the most impacted, disproportionately impacted by certain disease areas. And COVID-19 has just put a spotlight on that. So I think for me, there was a lot of drive personally that I had a responsibility. Now I'm part of this family, and I know how important it is to ensure that people like my family are represented.
Yeah, well, it's sort of the point that you made earlier around the interconnectivity between the professional and the personal. And it's amazing when you can find ways to do work that you find meaningful and impactful. And I've always thought about all of us as not just individuals, but at some point in our life trajectory, we're either going to be patients or caregivers. So I'm so glad you were able to identify a role within Pfizer that really fit within who you are now, and the evolution of your growth as a woman and as a professional for the past almost, 16 plus years and counting. So thank you for sharing that. So now I would love for you to provide us with a top-line overview of current initiatives that Pfizer is leading to increase representation of African Americans and other minorities in clinical trials.
Sure. Yeah. So first, I'll probably start with the fact that Pfizer is committed to ensuring clinical trial diversity, equity, and inclusion in our clinical trials, and that has been a staple of our priorities for years. But over the course of the last year, 2020 being a year of change in every possible way, and with COVID-19 disproportionately impacting communities of color at drastic numbers, we have restated our commitment to equity and inclusion. And our goal is to ensure that our clinical trials represent the populations of within the countries that we run our clinical trials, right? So we want to have represented or intended populations in our clinical trials. And we know that that's not always been the case in the history. So we have really focused on a recommitment in this space. And it probably makes sense for me to clarify, like, what's our definition of diversity? Because I think you automatically go to race and ethnicity as the two main areas of focus. But for us, it's a four-pronged approach. So we're thinking, you know, when we think of diversity, it's race and ethnicity, absolutely. But it's also age and gender. We have a responsibility to also increase representation of women in clinical trials and our aging population. So that's also an important focus for us. So just defining diversity, I think is important. Within my role at Pfizer, I work very closely with our clinical study teams that are responsible for designing, implementing, and executing clinical trials. And my focus is finding ways to enable our study teams to increase representation and representation of those populations that have been historically missed in clinical trials. So Black and African American, Hispanic, Latinx have been a big focus. When we think of how do we do this, because this has been a long-standing problem that not only Pfizer, but other sponsors are trying to tackle. We know that this is not something that will just organically happen. We have to dig in and do better. And so over the course of this year, really identifying what are the barriers to entry for communities of color. And then how, as a sponsor, can we remove or reduce the barrier or the burden to a participant or a patient? And so we've been really focused on that. We also understand the importance of tracking this information in real time. So in our clinical trials, how do we, in real time, track the representation in our clinical trials during the course of a recruitment window, and then make course corrections if we are not reaching the population that we should be because of the disease state.
Right. I mean, I could clap. I'm not quite sure if that will be the right response, but I'm very happy to hear this. I've seen some of the data for Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, and it's nice to see the diverse populations that are represented. And to your point, it's not just about race and ethnicity, but also around age and gender. And those are important components. I also love how you tied in earlier your definition of scientific innovation in terms of advocacy, listening to patients, and then thinking about patient engagement. How can we come up with digital technology tools that can make sure that we are responding in real time to dynamic changes in the patient population, patient responsiveness, etc. So this is really remarkable stuff, and I am virtually clapping. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And I think it's also, to tie into what you just mentioned, I think one of the things that we are really cognizant and aware of is the importance of connecting with the trusted voice in the communities, right? So pharmaceutical sponsors are not the trusted voice, and for many reasons, right? There's history there. So it's really important for us to connect with multicultural advocacy partners who are the voice of the community, who can help provide insights of what their community that they represent, what do they need, and how do we raise education and awareness. And sometimes it's as simple as the opportunity of a clinical trial. If we are not presenting the opportunity of a clinical trial in communities of color, then we shouldn't be shocked that we are not reaching them. So we need to really partner well with the trusted voice and listen, take those insights and apply what we can to how we operate and execute so that we can hopefully remove those burdens or barriers for those communities.
Oh my goodness. I like the emphasis on the trusted voice. I mean, historically, we know about the Tuskegee experiment, Henrietta Lacks debacle. We know about examples of things that have gone wrong in clinical studies in the past that have led to a lack of trust, especially within the African American community when it comes to clinical trials. So being able to partner with trusted voices and encouraging peer-to-peer education is really quite remarkable. But then it also makes me think about my follow-on question, which is, how sustainable do you think, of course, in your opinion, that these changes that are being made are going to be, like, is it going to be sustainable, right? How are we going to be able to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on clinical trials and drug access, not just for the next year or two, but for, the near future?
Yeah, and I think this is a great question because I think it comes down to sustainability. So what strategies and tactics can we put in place to increase equity and inclusion, but then are we putting strategies and tactics in place that are sustainable? And when I think of clinical trial diversity, and one of the biggest barriers that we dig into is trust or mistrust that exists in these communities. That is not something that we can flip a light switch on and fix. So it's going to take a long-term investment. And so when I think of sustainability, everything that we're trying to implement here at Pfizer needs to be for the long term.
Exactly.
We can't talk about this in 2020 because this now has a spotlight because of COVID-19.
Right.
This needs to be a conversation and a dialogue that happens year after year, and we continue to grow and learn over the course year to year. And so sustainability is everything. We need to make sure that this conversation doesn't get swept away next year or the year to come. So we need to stay committed and focused to this work because that's the only way that we are going to help with the trust barrier. Right. In order to be a trusted voice and a trusted partner, we have to prove that we're in this for the long term. And when I think of diversity and equity, it's the long game. We just have to stay here in these communities and help build awareness, education, and trust.
I really like your long-term view because of the pivotal role that you play in clinical trial operations at Pfizer. And it makes me quite happy to hear that. And as we've talked about now, you've been at Pfizer for over 16 years. Wow. And focusing on a diversity and inclusion perspective, what types of changes have you seen within Pfizer, especially as it relates to prominent leadership positions for women and, of course, for minorities?
Yeah, so over the course of 16 years, I think the last few years, there's been a really big focus from our senior most leaders to be really transparent in hiring practices for both women and minorities, which has been great. And so we have, within my organization, which is Global Product Development, we have our senior most leaders being very vocal about the importance of making sure that the folks that have a seat at the table, it's well represented. So it's not this table that is it has been years past, right? Right. That there's women at the table, that there are that this is a colorful table as well. Like we are representing minorities as well. So I'm proud as a Pfizer employee to see the communications that are coming out from HR, from our senior leaders on their focus and commitment to increasing equity and inclusion in our hiring practices and promotion practices as well. So I'm super proud of this company for so many reasons, but that's just one of them.
Well, that's great. I mean, I like your honesty. And I think if you look at the timeline, 3 years ago, there seems to be a big shift. I don't know if that has to do with the shift in the CEO as well, because Albert Bola has done a remarkable job in leading the company. But I like that you recognize the growth in the company. And, you know, as long as people are making changes and those changes are sustainable, I'm all for it. So my next question for you is, what advice would you give young people in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, you know, STEM, especially women who may be interested in joining a biotech or pharmaceutical company?
So I love this question as well, because I feel like this is so important. And so I'll go back to one of my earlier responses with just say yes, right? So our youth just need to say yes. But I think it's so important that we're promoting STEM programs in elementary and middle schools, and essentially really building out a diverse clinical workforce of our future. And so one of the things that we often hear when we speak to advocacy partners, multicultural partners, is that communities of color, because of this trust issue, this trust barrier, they trust someone that looks or speaks like them. And we need to do better at partnering with clinical research investigators of color. And so how do we as a sponsor help foster this pipeline, and how do we help build this pipeline of clinical workforce? And I think it's for increasing minority researchers, and not just researchers, but nurses, like everyone plays a part in this clinical workforce ecosystem, and women. And so for me, I'm raising two children in this house that are 9 and 11, and both my husband and I working at Pfizer are really big proponents of STEM programs, and especially for our daughter, making sure that she recognizes that science, math, engineering, coding are not just things that boys and men do, but that this is something that as women, we can also do this. And there shouldn't be the barrier there. So I'm all for STEM programs. I think they're crucial and important, and will help us to the end point, get us to the point where we have a diverse workforce in our future.
I couldn't agree with you more. I was born in Nigeria, and I think for the longest time, I struggled to be a scientist. I mean, I got my PhD in medicinal chemistry. I will tell you that those were some of my hardest years, because my family struggled with understanding why a young woman would want to be a scientist and to be a chemist. Like, oh, that is so difficult. That are easier things to do, right? And so I love the focus on encouraging our youth to think about things, not as challenges, but also as opportunities. So thank you for sharing that. And as we prepare to wrap up, I just have 2 more questions for you.
Sure.
So thinking broadly, what do you think are some key consideration factors that will be important for sustaining innovation in the life science industry?
This is a great one. So I think it's important for us. I think I'll always come back to the listening. In order for us to continue to innovate how we do things, within the walls of Pfizer, and within industry, I think it's really important that we continue to listen. I also think that it's really important that as an industry, we come together, right? So I know what we're doing within the walls of Pfizer, and how much of a commitment we're making to this work and advancing this work. And I know other companies are doing exactly the same. But it's really important for us to come to the table together. And how do we as an industry tackle this in a really innovative way? Because I think there's obviously things that we can do internally at Pfizer to shape how we operate, but the external work that has to happen shouldn't necessarily be driven only by one company. So I think it's really important that industry comes together
Right.
Because I think we're all trying to tackle the same, we all understand the same issue, and we're all trying to tackle it probably in very similar ways. But how do we do this together? Because I think at the end of the day, we are better together. Yeah. And I think it goes a long way for the community to see how sponsors come together to, in a non-competitive way, to really advance this equity and inclusion and science in general.
Yeah, I mean, I love the focus on collaboration. I think that that's going to be integral for the future. And we've seen so many collaborations resulting as a result of COVID-19. But how do we sustain that collaboration so that 10 years from now, we're not back to like, oh, I'm not going to tell you. I think there's a need for increased transparency and increased collaboration. So in closing, I usually give the floor to my guest to share any final commentary or thoughts that they might have. So it's your turn, Sandy.
Thank you so much. I mean, in closing, I wanted to first thank you for the opportunity to just have this conversation today and to spotlight the work on clinical trial diversity. It's so critically important for us to get this right. And I think 2020 has shown us a lot of things. It's shown us what we can do in difficult times when we didn't think we could do it. And if I always think of, you look at the year that we've just had and what are the positive things that we can take away from this year? Yeah. And I really feel like this is our opportunity to really get this right. Yes. Right. This is the springboard we needed to get this right. And we have the responsibility to do this. And so I'm really, as we look into 2021, I'm really optimistic of what we can advance in this space. So I'm excited about the work and obviously very passionate about the work we're doing. So yeah, I'm so glad that people are talking about this now. Yes. And I think that's acknowledging that this has been an issue for so long is so important. So I'm just, thank you for talking about this and bringing this to your audience. And it was just really nice to meet a fellow former Groton Pfizer colleague.
I think once you work with Pfizer, it's been described as a revolving door. You're going to keep having relationships with people from Pfizer. And there's a reason for that. I think that anyone that chooses to work for any pharmaceutical company, including, of course, Pfizer, is someone that has a mission to have some type of impact. And I think you've done a remarkable job with clinical trial diversity. It's obviously an important theme for the season of this podcast and also for future seasons. And I'm glad that Pfizer is listening. And I'm glad that people like you are advancing the narrative. So thank you for such a natural, intelligent, candid conversation with a brilliant woman that is doing very great things personally and professionally. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a great day.